people do not turn to the urban historians of the Eastern Mediterranean. In part, this phenomenon has a long history in itself. However, I would claim it is also to some degree our fault. The way we portray our findings, they often do not speak to the big discussions people have about these countries and regions. Sick. If you look at a photograph like this one, taken sometime around the end of the 19th century on the quays of Izmir, you will see these pedestrians here in the center. What can we say just by looking at them? If you have the picture in front of you in large, you can see these two men with their backs turned to the camera. They're dressed in baggy pants, white coats with thick kerchiefs around their fezzes. Overall, one would term this kind of dress traditional. You have this other person right here walking towards us who is dressed in a perfect Western suit. If you just would cut this picture to show only these three people, you could say it's a clash of culture, almost a collision course between the traditionally dressed and the modern dressed. However, there's also this person, the older man, who's walking next to them, who manages to blend, for example, the lengthy coat and the fez with Western style trousers. You have even further to the right here, this other person with very tightly tailored suit, very short beard, plus fez. It is not so much for the modern or against the modern how these people decide to dress. In fact, they chose various blends of attire to express themselves. What about Salonica? Now, this is 1917, when it is actually not an Ottoman town anymore. As you can see, the residents stayed up to date with developments in architecture, such as the recent Art Nouveau style. You find this Olympia cinema built according to it. And what do people actually go to see at the cinema? If you can read these billboards of the movies these people are lining up for, one is in French, here or here, L'homme qui assassina, a French movie where the story actually takes place in Istanbul. That is why you can see on the billboard once again a man with a fez here. Also, there's an American movie, Hearts of the West, that's on the upper panel. Although this is occupied Salonica in 1917, you do not actually see many French or British soldiers in the audience. You see a lot of people dressed in civil clothes. You see a lot of women, and in particular, a lot of girls with their white bonnets sticking out of the crowd, here, 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 for example. So one can learn these people still have a lot of interest in topics centered around Istanbul. They easily deal with English or French films, as this is obviously still part of their horizon, their world. And the same goes for early 20th century Istanbul. You see more adventures into modern architecture, like here in the center of the picture, the prominent building of the Wiener Bankenverein in Art Nouveau, for example, and the mosque with its experimental shape behind it. If you look to the right of the screen, you will see advertisement, not only in French Latin letters, but also in Ottoman Arabic, Cyrillic, and Armenian writing. Here to the other side, you might just faintly make out advertisement in Latin and Greek letters. To sum up, these were highly diverse places, yet strangely, to us, these pictures look rather exotic. Someone born in late 20th or early 21st century Greece or Turkey would look at them differently than someone gazing at an old photograph of Piccadilly Circus, Unter den Linden, or Champs-Élysées. They would not be in the center of a history book on Turkey, Southeast Europe, or the like. they are relegated to our slightly exotic field of history of Ottoman cities. As I had said, this is in part due to historiography. You could trace this neglect all the way to Karl Marx, to Max Weber, from whom I have a quote here, past Bernard Lewis or Immanuel Wallerstein. The general idea they share are that cities outside of Europe are not very interesting. This is based on the belief that both the Ottoman Empire and the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole were agricultural societies. Therefore, historians do not have to concern themselves with them at all. Strictly speaking, if you read this quote, they are boring. But I would say this is an attitude we have to counter. This is not just an academic question, because this attitude continues to inform the opinions people have about these societies until today. So in order to do that, we have to tackle the more classic issues, the big questions of the modern history of the region. And one of them is Europeanization. That is the question whether this region in the 19th century started to change substantially under the influence of its Western neighbors, and what exactly the nature of this change was. When deciding to tackle this question, I was asking myself, what can I do differently in dealing with these questions as an urban and cultural historian? On the one hand, I obviously choose different phenomena to analyze. But apart from that, I selected a few frameworks in order to make sure that I have a different perspective. One of the frameworks is definitely the city. I don't want to write a history of the Ottoman Empire, not that there is no Ottoman history in this, but I take the city seriously as a space, an urban arena in which the exact forms of what Europeanization will look like is contested, experimented with, perhaps discarded, perhaps transformed in the process. In order to do this, it is important to take the people in the city seriously as agents, no matter what nationality or ethnic identity they had. This is not simply out of political correctness. This is about trying to understand the particular culture that was created in this period. Trying to understand it without a priori dividing the urban residents into Greeks, Armenians, and the like. Because more often than not, the experience of the urban space is not that different from community to community. It is also to allow several residents who do not have Ottoman nationality to be seen as part of this urban culture. They were important for it, as I could tell from my work, especially with Habsburg consular material. Second, Europe or Europeanization is on the one hand the object of my study, but it is also one of the perspectives. A lot of people in this time considered the Eastern Mediterranean, or at least their respective city, a corner of Europe, as one contemporary writer, Refik Halit wrote. You could find a number of other quotes with roughly the same meaning from this period, for example, in the press. What difference does it make? We tend to frame the Ottoman Empire as the antithesis of Europe, as the Orient facing the Occident. But I think that in many ways, we can actually learn more by interpreting some of the social phenomena we see as part of some wider trans-European continuity. I do not want to claim that there were no differences between the Ottoman Empire and the rest of Europe. However, the study of Portugal or Ireland would also lead to for the historian to concede differences here or there. Also, at least on a theoretical level, we're anyways beyond the point that we claim there is a singular model of European development. Third, I try to take the Mediterranean dimension in this seriously. The sea is, quote, a space of asymmetric relationships and shared experiences among Europe, the Maghreb, and the Middle East. That's a literal quote by Manuel Boruta and Sakis Gekas. In addition, in my sources, I mix rather liberally between different types of sources. Sources related to different social strata and to actions in addition to the written word. The book is organized according to different sections on space, entertainment, and identities, and also how this particular culture came to an end. I will try to skim briefly over it and perhaps focus a little bit more on the aspect of identities. So first to the question of space in the more narrow sense of the word. The imagined and the constructed space of the Mediterranean cities. What was it determined by? To begin with, the Mediterranean dimension. In 1798, the Napoleonic forces defeated the Ottoman ones in Egypt rather easily. As of this time, it is common knowledge that the Ottomans are not a naval power anymore. They could be forced to relinquish their part of the Mediterranean. However, as we all know, this did not happen immediately. For over 100 years, this region remains by and large Ottoman, a few colonies and breakaway states on Ottoman soil notwithstanding. Therefore, the state is no longer the dominant power. When it comes to conceptualizing this region's fate, what its future holds, it becomes apparent that you do not have a single power to replace the Ottoman void, or instead you have several great powers which try to balance each other out. That is, of course, no new insight. But the question I try to answer is, what impact does that have on the level of ideology? How is this ideological gap filled once Pax Ottomana has come to an end? I found that its place is taken by something I call the European dream. From Napoleon's landing in Egypt, past other initiatives by the French embassy in Constantinople in this period, until the eve of World War I, in different ways, people repeated, reiterated, reformulated a promise to the population of the Ottoman Empire, namely, that there is a wider world out there the Ottomans could be a part of, a community of cultured nations, as the scholar Martin Hartmann calls it. The slide shows a few random expressions of this promise around 1860. I find it important to state that this is something different than the white man's burden or other forms of civilizing missions. It is the claim that the Eastern Mediterranean population could be among the winners of the 19th century process of change. The condition is performance, that the locals should engage with commerce, adapt the cultural fashions emanating from the West. That is the message the European dream brings across. It's very debatable when in history and by whom this was meant genuinely, and at what time such claims were rather meant to pacify the locals. And this need not be resolved in every detail. In fact, I don't really try to do that in my book. What is more important to remember, the locals seized this vision and acted upon it. We see, for example, among these quotes, Mehmet Reşit Pasha, a governor of Aydın at the time. But it was not only the elites who embraced the European dream. You will find also middle-class locals expressing their support, and here is one example of that. Europeanization was not only undertaken to be recognized as equals by foreigners. It was also a tool to process change in a way allowing the residents to live in the cities according to their own desires. One aspect where you can see a solidification of this idea is the quest for a beautiful urban space. Part of the desire for Europeanization touched upon the question of how the cities should look. People at the time were rather unhappy with the waterfront images their cities gave. As you can see here in this picture of 1860 Smyrna, these ramshackle warehouses are not the best postcard image a city could hope for. There were obviously material and state interests to change the situation, but the change was also a result of an initiative for beautification of the cities. After some rather long struggles I will not go into here, the seafront is actually changed according to modern norms of regularity, symmetry, beauty, and efficiency of transport. And this, while there have been changes after, this is sort of the basic pattern of what the city looks like until today. From these new spaces, new sociabilities evolved. One of the main activities was the corso or volta, which meant that you had to get up, you had to get dressed up in chic attire, go up and down the waterfront at sunsets, and this is an activity which still exists in some Mediterranean cities today. This topic of sociability leads me to the second section on entertainment. While many activities in some form already existed, especially among foreigners from overseas, several expressions of culture expanded and were enjoyed by a larger section of the local population as of the mid-19th century. I will only briefly touch on them as I have talked about them in other presentations. Society balls are important events in all of these cities throughout the period. Theater in general, but especially opera, becomes an obsession. I speak in the book of opera mania. As Adam Mestian has already described in his PhD thesis, from about the 1830s onwards, this fascination with opera precipitates a huge exchange. This meant artisans, artists, musicians, stage builders actually traveling from Italy, France, and other distant places in order to meet the Ottoman demand for theater and especially opera. Another commodity I wish to mention is beer. Hardly known around the Eastern Mediterranean at the beginning of the 19th century, it becomes at least the second most popular drink of the region. This, on the one hand, brings forth upscale sites of entertainment, as we see here, the Viennese beer house in Pera, Beyoğlu, known also by its owner's name as Yannis. But also, beer produced other sites of socialization, which were not necessarily as upper class, nor as old, nor as male as in the previous picture, as one can see in this image from a beer garden. Beer, just as taking part in balls or visiting the opera, was a possibility for people to show their openness to change on the one hand, but also their cultural capital. Especially the balls were opportunities also to perform inter-ethnic harmony. In addition, all these 19th century European forms of entertainment offered new possibilities for intergender sociabilities. So now on to the topic of identities, which is obviously one of the central issues in 19th century history of the Eastern Mediterranean. First of all, I would like to play you a short extract from a song, which I find helpful for understanding the particulars of identity in this period. So just bear with me while I fetch the song here. Um, just a second. All right, there I am again. Um, so what is this song about? You have to imagine the streets of Izmir before the Great Fire of 1922. A man approaches a woman and asks her, "Are you Turkish? Are you Greek? Or are you English or French? You are so beautiful." And after such an aggressive pass, the woman must, of course, in some way put him back into his place. So she says, "What is it to you whether I'm in from Menemen or from Cordelio, which is Karşıyaka? Um, and I will wear my shalvar any color I like." So why are we dealing with a song which was perhaps sung in some bars back then when trying to assess identities on the Eastern Mediterranean shores? I find it significant because it stresses the aspect of ambivalence. The man begins by asking about the ethnicity of the woman he is attracted to. However, he never manages to make her commit to the one or the other. Also, we do not know whether this woman really wants to get rid of her admirer or simply wants him or simply wards him off to defend her public image. All of these things, including identifying with nationality or different suburbs, are in flux in this song. This is something I find rather particular to this period of time. Looking for other examples of more fluid identity, I found a number of names in Protestant and Catholic baptism registers in these cities from the beginning of the 20th century. You can see that at least some people have started to mix, to give their children Italian and Arabic names, or a German and Greek name, or German and Turkish, as in the last two examples. This goes to show that there are people who identify positively with mixed cultures and identities. Is the topic of mixed identities in between something new, you might ask? I could definitely not claim so. This has been reflected upon a lot, both in contemporary literature and in later writings. Sheriff Marden draws our attention to the novel Araba Sevdası by Recaizade Mahmud Ekrem, which was first published in 1896. He sees the main character, Bihruz Bey, as exemplary of a condition contemporaries see as a malaise, a feeling of unease, of things being out of place. What is this Bihruz Bey syndrome, as Sheriff Martin calls it? It is described as a form of arrested developments between East and West, old and new, modern and unmodern. For example, Bihruz Bey, in order to attract the attention of the woman he adores, tries to translate first Persian poetry, then French poetry. He manages neither, none of them come out right. He has a high interest in material things, modern dress, the canes, the coats he wears. So you can, he would sort of fit to that beer table you see on the right-hand side of that slide. He despises the simple rural people of his times. This is a character default Mahmoud Ekrem wanted to draw attention to, and which you can find other examples of in the literature. However, while I think Sheriff Martin's observations are absolutely correct, I think that we can take this a step further if we try to see this not as a phenomenon of Easterners facing the West, but rather of a situation which reflects in some part what people were going through all over Europe, if not all over the world at this time. In this context, I found this quote here by Moitz Chaki, as well as his writings in general, very helpful. Chaki reflects here on the Habsburg cities in the 19th century as multicultural sites. He draws on the writings of several contemporary authors to understand this feeling people had of in-betweenness or lack of qualities. Robert Musil's man without qualities is the stereotypical character in these writings. People who are bombarded by different possibilities the modern world offers them, but in the end never really manage to act upon the possibilities which they are confronted with. Instead, as you can see in this comic book version of Robert Musil's Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, Ulrich, the main character, lies in bed and fantasizes about things in the world based upon his readings. So this is something I find rather helpful, to look at some German language authors to understand things which also affect people in the urban centers around the Eastern Mediterranean. One of the writers I find particularly helpful is Friedrich Nietzsche. If you look at this short passage, I think what he describes is something similar to what Bihrus Bey and the man without qualities experienced in later decades. The sensation that there are so many different morals, different arts, different sets of values, bombarding the individual that he or she is no longer able to act upon them. Even if there are great changes in your time, you end up contemplating things and not taking part in them. So what do you do if you are afflicted by this malaise, the Bihrus Bey syndrome, or have become a person without qualities? Friedrich Nietzsche's suggestion runs somewhat like this. We cannot take this transitional period we live in seriously, but what we can do is try to make the most of those freedoms we have. The fact that everything is in flux, that things one day are attached to certain values, next day are seen differently. The message is go out there and enjoy it as much as you can. And that is what I see expressed in that song by Muammer Ketencoğlu I briefly played earlier. Are there more examples of the Mediterranean port cities residents framing their experience of the modern world in a similar vein to Nietzsche? Yes, there are plenty. One very interesting discussion I found in the Journal de Salonique in a series of letters to the editor from 1895 into early 1896. So what were turn of the century Salonica residents discussing in this French language newspaper? The quality of men and women of Salonica. The discussion is kicked off by the editor-in-chief, Vitalis Cohen, writing under his pen name of Sheridan. He describes the young unmarried women as the 11th plague Moses forgot to smite Egypt with, showing all their unfulfilled dreams and suppressed desires for a husband. At the end of this lengthy, very sexist satire, what does he suggest to do? Since there are so many brunettes in town, one might as well send them off to the Mormons in Salt Lake City, because they can have 50 wives, and this way Salonica could be rid of them. Already then, media professionals such as Vitalis Cohen knew that provocation will get you readers, and retorts will get you to be the talk of the town. Nonetheless, I believe even the editors of the paper were surprised about the number of letters on this subject that continued to pour in over weeks. In the next issue, we have a letter to the editor by a young lady, as her pseudonym goes. She retorts by heading into the opposite direction, saying, if we are the young women of Salonica take so long to inspect what is to be had on the marriage bazaar, it is because we find very few suitable candidates. This is a city of commerce. These men never talk about anything but their business. They do not exercise their bodies. They do not exercise their minds. There's no intellectual, poetic, idealist activity. When we have to dance with them, they tire easily and do not know how to dance because they have never bothered to learn how. Therefore, the overall interest in Salonica men is low. Next, a male writer pitches in, claiming, yes, it is true, our city is nothing but commerce. Therefore, life is difficult. He even uses the Darwinian phrase struggle for life in the English original. How could we exercise our bodies when we can't even ride a bicycle in this town because it would get stuck in the mud as there are no properly paved streets? Next, another man writes saying, what is the charm in these women anymore? These days, everyone has a piano and even the servant personnel dresses as if they are baronesses. He therefore has decided to enjoy his bachelor life a little longer, but accepts that he should, in this case, help his mother and sister with the household. What can we read from this very quaint, very middle class kind of discussion? I think this is a straightforward negotiation of contemporary gender roles. It shows that port city residents were unhappy with their ascribed roles. But as becomes apparent, they do not manage to take the decisive step to make the most out of what they have been reading in their French novels, in newspapers, which are supposedly a window onto the wider world. Just as Robert Musil's Man Without Qualities, they end up just contemplating on the possibilities of the modern world, still hoping that someday the knight in shining armor or the femme fatale will appear, grab them by the hand, and take them out of this conceited, stagnant Salonica in order to lead them to the promises the modern world holds for them. So in a very different genre, this is also a reflection on a malaise. What strikes me is that it does not come out of the advice literature of the late Ottoman period, which has been thoroughly studied in recent years. Instead, this is something resulting from everyday life experiences and described by people immediately affected by them. I looked at some other recent publications to answer the question, when in this period do people actually experience this feeling of inadequacy? And when do people actually manage to overcome it and get a sense that they, according to the Nietzschean expression, manage to live in the light, making the most of this weird transitional period they live in? There are actually several outlets, it seems, just to mention a few. Katja Jana lists cross-dressing as one of them, not dressing perfectly Ottoman, not perfectly Western, but coming up with these weird in-between combinations, as we've seen in this slide of people walking along the the Smyrna quays. Seçil Yilmaz gives us the example of how a doctor finds medicinal discourse an excuse to speak out openly about sexual intercourse in bourgeois society. Murat Yildiz has used gymnasts as an example of people who broke out of their prescribed gender roles, and this list could be greatly extended. However, there are a lot of discourses in this period usually tied to nation-building projects or to the concomitant project of creating a national bourgeoisie as a community of sentiment following certain cultural rules. Within these projects, people are instructed to stay away from what is considered excesses, the too liberal spirit of the age. I see this trope of literature as standing against this free-spirited, free-minded way of dealing with the modern world. The gist of the argumentation reads, yes, we might need modern math and foreign languages, but on the other hand, we need to focus on our community, on family values and these kind of things. I do not have time to go further into this kind of discourse, but I think a number of you will know the kind of literature I'm referring to, this advice literature, this literature about how one should live in the modern world and whatnot. The last major section of the book deals with the disintegration of this particular era during which this urban culture came to bloom by, on the one hand, anti-European discourses, but also by a type of angry young man and woman, which Pankaj Mishra speaks about in his Age of Anger. This was for me a very helpful way to address the unraveling of the port cities. and the subsequent nationalization of space, of which you see two examples here on the Izmir and the Salonica waterfront. That is in the center of those two port cities. So to sum up, the process of Europeanization was not just a matter of conscious political decision-making by the Sultan, his elite bureaucracy, or later political parties. It was an organic process that influenced the culture and the lives of millions, and influenced such everyday questions as what to wear, how to lead a conversation, how to spend your leisure time, and what qualities to look for in a potential marriage partner. Within this process, it was less the question of making a conscious choice for or against a set toolbox to install modernity, which was waiting there with the instruction manual attached. Modernity was still an ongoing project, and the residents of the port cities decided to jump aboard, believing that it could prove helpful, not only to end up among the winners of the New World Order, but also to fulfill their desires for the urban space, pleasure, and identity building. The European dream or promise of joining a world, or the European dream or promise of joining a world on the move was not a coherent policy, but the results of the gap between an Ottoman imperial center that no longer managed to integrate its subjects into a common imperial narrative of legitimacy, and on the other hand, of the influence of other European countries. These were most of the time present in the late Ottoman sphere, more through schools, immigrants, novels, or leisure activities such as having a beer or visiting the opera, than through direct political control. However, the psychic tensions of existing in a space exposed to the multiple possibilities of the modern world, without a strong state to identify with, precipitated counter-discourses to rein in the ongoing free experiments and ultimately the rise of a group of angry young men and women who played an important role in finally seeing the cities they were born in and their cultural order go up in flames. This is but one contribution that illustrates how this field of urban and cultural history can lead to more nuanced perceptions of processes that are usually addressed in the framework of political history. Okay, and I'll leave it at that and would like to hear your questions or comments. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Thank you very much, Malte. I think there are lots of questions from the audience. So, but there was already one question in the chat box at the beginning of the lecture. Maybe I'll start with that. From Michal Polachowski. Dear Malte, are there any examples of Byzantine, late Byzantine, secular architecture left in the Eastern Mediterranean? Any known photographies?
And you know, what was the last part, sorry?
Any known photographies, photos, images, known images?
Yeah, well, Salonica obviously is very rich in these things, has several ancient churches, which play a major part in this re-Grekification of Salonica space. So what you see is that these churches are placed very prominently in the new street grids. You have roads leading to them. Salonica very much, yes. Izmir has very little left, and in parts, I think this is also due to rapid developments. The present municipality is trying to make these more visible, is trying to attract more attention to these actually. So there's a positive re-identification after the city was originally nationalized in such a way that to sort of sever the links with the Greek past. And Istanbul, you know, is Istanbul. It's the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire. I don't think you have a lack of finding things there, even though there is, I would say, in recent years, a more or less conscious, although not official, policy to make these less visible and to make Istanbul appear more as an Islamic city rather than a city of continuity from antiquity onwards.
Yeah. Maria has a question about a photo about Selanik. Maria, please go on.
Thank you very much. Her şey merhaba. I speak to you from Salonica. Thank you very much for your fascinating talk. And as I'm already writing a paper on the transitional past of Salonica, which is a city with a strong Ottoman past. Unfortunately, this Ottoman past, as we all know, we have a few monuments left. For example, the city's minarets were sold just for pieces once the Greek army and the integration of the city to the Greek state has been approved by the by all parties involved. However, I would like to ask your help on this photo that you showed. It was on the front of the quay of the city, where you see many people sit there, like young people, children. You said that it might be from 1917. However, I just I watched many photos, and as soon as the Allies, and we know that Salonica was the center of the Macedonian front. So we have armies like the English army, we have the French army. So there are many photos, and I've seen them especially from Imperial War Museum archives, where the cities are flocked with soldiers. So it might be slightly earlier, this photo. And I'm not attributing it to a later stage, because Thessaloniki, unfortunately, there is a very exact date about the Europeannization of the city. It is the date of the big fire which destroyed the urban center of the city. This is when Ernest Ebrar comes in. The minarets has already fallen, have been destructed. Unfortunately, only one minaret survives today. The one minaret that survives today in Salonica is the Rotunda minaret. And Ernest Ebrar comes and approves or gives the city its European vision. Much as you also wonderfully pointed out the common how much Izmir and Salonica look. I mean, their final facade, the European facade, resembles. So yes, I would like to have your comment on this photo and what the information that I provided you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting you bring up this the date of this photo. I had originally two conflicting dates. One actually, as you would have suggested, before the occupation. So something around 1913, 1914, possibly. And then somebody else identifies it as a 1917 picture, or 1917, anyways, during the occupation, and by a French photographer who's there with the army. And I looked back and forth, and in the end, I do believe the latter is the case, that this is part of this series of photos this French photographer took. And I think in the crowd, while I said by majority they are civilian clothes, I could see a number of soldiers, and if I identified them correctly, these could be Allied uniforms. But so I don't want to claim 100% this must be the case. I'm happy to look at it again. However, this must be, yeah, from this short window before most of the waterfront buildings are destroyed in the 1917 fire. That definitely. Otherwise, as far as the continuity is concerned, I think we have, yeah, a lot of things have been done, unfortunately, in the early decades of the post-Ottoman years. But when in recent times people have asked, like, okay, when has ever a Christian country not reverted a church into a church, but left it as a museum? Actually, the Rotunda came to my mind as one of the examples in a city where there are plenty of bad examples how to treat heritage, where it was actually in recent times made very visible that this building has had several different layers of history through Muslim times, through late Byzantine times, and that you can actually see this in the building.
And of course, there are other Ottoman monuments in the city. For example, Alajai Maret, and well, they are still, of course, they have been refurbished, but there is still much to do in Thessaloniki.
I would agree. I mean, it is a question, on the one hand, it's not a question whether these buildings are there at all. It's a question, and that's, I think, what they are trying to address in Izmir, in particular with their project Izmir Tarih, to sort of integrate these buildings into the urban space, that somebody who lives there and gets this feeling, this is part of my city. And just the imaret you mentioned, it's the way I remember, it's sort of like modern buildings are built around it, so you do not see it, whereas these often very tiny little old Byzantine churches, you will see them from miles away because there are open roads and open space all around them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there any questions, or can I have a question? How representative, Malte, are these cities of the phenomenon you explored? Antalya was also, or other port cities, maybe Mersin on the eastern part of the Mediterranean. How representative are these? And also, I have always the question of the uniqueness of the Ottoman Empire, basically the Ottoman society, which was different from a European society, as it has multilingual, multi-ethnic, and cultural diversity was a normal thing. So it was unique in that sense. And as we know from the economically economic integration of the Ottoman merchants, that a family from the island of Chios could have actually worked in Britain, for example, not just in the continental Europe or in the Balkans. They had these larger families working in different parts of continental and also in Britain. So how would you interpret this uniqueness and the complex aspect of the Ottoman society? I think it really differs. And at the end, after the integration of to the world economy, after the 19th century, let's say 1815, we also see the petit bourgeoisie appearing in the Ottoman society with its own preferences and tastes, and they wanted to embrace the European values per se. But also they had, from the Greek Orthodox point of view, they also had the connection with the Byzantine heritage and the Byzantine legacy. So I think it's a very, it's not an easy task to explore the Europeanization. I wonder how you approach to this uniqueness, and also how representative are these three cities? Why didn't you include Antalya, for example? Thank you, Malte.
Okay, so lots of big but interesting questions there. On the one hand, I think it's important to keep in mind the question of scale. I think Antalya was at the time a very provincial town by comparison to these cities I've mentioned. The cities I should have ideally included would have been Beirut and Alexandria. However, on the one hand, there's been some work on them. On the other hand, I do not know Arabic, so I don't know. I would have, my view on them would have been a bit limited. These are the big cities. These are cities of hundreds of thousands of people. That's a big number in these times. Istanbul was one of the maybe 7 cities in Europe which had 1 million people, inhabitants, and the 200,000 to 300,000 Salonica and Izmir had by the end of the 19th century was also something on the European scale. Not Antalya, not Mersin, I'm not so sure about, but I think all of these towns rather developed later. I'm thinking about these towns also because they have these were the primal export places, the largest ports, the ones most integrated into international commerce. You wouldn't have that. You would also not have this degree of mixing. Not saying it's not there. Like, for example, if I found Austrian musicians on tour, they would move from Salonika also into Manastır or other smaller Üsküp or other smaller inland towns. They were not completely off the grid, but the difference of scale is important. And I'm always a bit hesitant, though, to make my cities sort of sound like so super unique or like in total contrast to what was going on a few hundred kilometers inland. We have to think that like a port like Izmir, which was the largest export port of the empire, if you don't include Alexandria. Such a place also necessitates a lot of movement into the hinterland. All of this stuff the city is exporting, carpets, opium, cotton, that means going several hundred kilometers inland, and not only caravans or trains, but also the traders and so on. So there's some kind of interaction going on. Nonetheless, I found a lot of, to sort of speak about this heterogeneity of the Ottoman space, I found like a lot of these phenomena actually do not penetrate so far into the hinterland. For example, there are statistics what districts actually produce beer. They are Istanbul with Bomonti, ends up on top. Salonica has its Olympos brewery, which is also very famous. Then there's a local brewery in Izmir. Already Beirut is pretty far low on the scale. And once you look into Bursa or Trabzon, the quantities being produced are, yeah, I don't know, like one hobby brewing afternoon, more or less. And if you look into the Arabic part of the empire, you will not find it in the sources at all, with, I think, the possible exception of Aden, I think, was the one source of the Arab world and beer outside of Beirut being mentioned. Yeah, as I have tried to show, I think the Ottoman Empire is not the one big exception to the European norm. On the one hand, we have the Habsburg Empire. You might say, okay, that's exception number 2, but we could go on about the Russian Empire, which is perhaps a bit of a debate whether you want to count it as part of the general European thing. But these are all states which deal in different degrees with diversity on a mass scale, and to a smaller degree, Germany, France, they were also still in Great Britain, they were also still in the process of integrating these very diverse cultures on their territory in the modern sense, which wasn't as necessary before the 19th century. As far as sort of the perspective of like local bourgeoisies are concerned in trying to construct their national culture and to go to sort of deal with questions of traditional values, Western modern impetus. I was sort of inspired by this book by Pankaj Mishra, Age of Anger, and his take on Dostoevsky and other intellectuals who sort of criticize materialism and other things the 19th century brings. And it seemed like quite often it was sort of, it didn't really matter. Like you could say, oh, the Islamic founding fathers or our Greek antiquity or our Byzantine rulers, it was sort of, you might say, just some kind of local input which was used to create a kind of conservative or possibly in some cases slightly reformist attitude, world vision to rein in what people did in port cities and what we don't find much in like first-person narratives, but the fact that people went out to these bars, brothels, drank a lot of stuff, dressed up in funny foreign dress and so on. There was, went to dance at the balls, never came back until the next morning in bad company or whatever. And I think whether you deducted that from Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Islamic, rabbinic kind of prohibitions against excessive behavior or egocentric behavior, to my impression, my very superficial take on this topic, did not really matter. It kind of formed a more or less comparable kind of ideology.
Thank you, Malte. I just would like to add one thing. I came across with the name of Danieloğlu from Antalya, who had a great undertaking in Istanbul. It was the 19th century. They initiated the translation of the European classics. These were actually Karamanlı people who were using the Greek alphabet, and they made huge translations. And what I really found interesting is always the network of these cities within the
Oops.
territory. They followed at the same time. They were popular in Europe. The classics, the French classics, for example, they translated in a publisher in Istanbul. Well, it's a very interesting topic. Thank you very much. I found it very, very interesting. Thank you. Very inspiring.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, what kind of amazes me is sort of the intellectual horizon of these people. Perhaps they didn't one-on-one import something which affected their local society all too often, but quite often also by reading these newspapers, we tend to sort of try to put things into geographical boxes in even as modern historians, but we see these people were aware of what was going on in Cuba or Japan or what else. They were not that provincial in their outlook onto the world, and it was not just sort of the France or Great Britain plus the Ottoman Empire. It was definitely also looking into other corners of the world.
So are there any other questions before we conclude?
Serjan Levent Konyar asked Malte if we have the chance to read the studies in English or in Turkish.
Yes, thank you, Levent Hocam. Do we have chance to read your studies in English or Turkish?
English. Yes, I'm trying to think, like one or two things have been published in Turkish as well, but most of my stuff is in English. Some things also in German, but definitely this book here at present from Cambridge, which I am talking about here, this is a product in which can be had in English.
So I think there is a final question. So thank you very much. We had another, I think, inspiring topic. Lots to look for again. Thank you very much, Malte. It was wonderful. And thank you, Maria. It's always nice to see you, by the way, and your questions, everything. Take care, everyone, and hope to meet in March, right, Luca?
In March, 11th of March, we will be back.
Yes, yes. So bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Malte. Thank you. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.